I'm David Pinsoff,
I'm David Pietrzewski
and this is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, actual evolutionary psychology.
by actual evolutionary psychologists.
Nailed it.
Today we have a wonderful guest, Josh Tybur.
Yes. Josh is a expert in the field of disgust and disease psychology, contamination. He's such a fun person to talk to, and his knowledge of this area is quite expansive and breathtaking, particularly because this is an area in evolutionary psychology that has led to a lot of ideas. It's been very generative. Some of these ideas are more dubious than others, and Josh is the perfect person to cut through the bullshit and tell you what is real, or at least what is the most promising direction to head in, and what is maybe more dubious. For me, I think it's extremely clarifying to get his take on all these issues in the literature on disgust, and it's such a huge topic. I mean, disgust touches on so many different aspects of our lives in a way that is really hard to appreciate until you talk to Josh. So we get into lots of stuff, discuss disease.
And I really appreciate about Josh that he is very careful and not a partisan in the sense of I always feel like I very much trust Josh's opinion about things in that he is just so careful and is not fragile epistemically. Like he'll entertain an idea, but then think about does this make sense? And he's just a lovely person to emulate in terms of the stance one takes towards ideas in the sense of entertaining them but also taking an arm's length take on them and saying, does this actually make sense? Even if it's coming from within EvPsych, for example.
Yes, he's one of the best examples, I think, of a marriage between really good theory and really good empirics. He's very good in both of those areas, which is rare.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely, yes. So Josh is a shining example of how to do EvPsych. So without further ado, here's Josh Tybur.
Enjoy.
So Josh Tybur, you are in the Netherlands. How did you get there?
Via airplane, Dave.
Okay,
Um,
good. We're done. Okay.
All
Have a
right.
good week,
Good to see you.
everybody. Josh, thanks for coming on. That was good. Okay,
so,
it's
uh,
easy.
yeah, I can give you the backstory. I was in a position to finish my PhD right when the great financial crisis was unfolding.
Mm.
And I struck out on the job market, which was exclusively targeted at the US for a couple of years. And I decided to try my luck out at a job ad in Amsterdam. And it turned out to be the only hit that I got. And I thought, well, that sounds like an exciting adventure to go continue my career in a foreign country. So I moved over to Amsterdam in 2011. It was initially just a 2-year contract. So jobs worked a little bit different out here rather than a tenure track. It was just you're an assistant professor for 2 years and we'll see how it goes from there. And yeah, I felt very at home here and both academically and personally. So I've ended up staying here. And now I'm married with a kid and fairly integrated into the academic system.
For those people who are, I mean, I think we're mostly American listeners. How is it different, either academically or personally? Not to get too personal, but we have 4 hours, so let's. Yeah.
Well, academically, I mean, there's tons of differences. The commonalities are that European researchers, or at least Dutch and UK, and to an extent French, German, many other countries, they're publishing in overlapping, largely similar academic journals, and a lot of them are coming to the same academic conferences. But there are differences in the education system. For example, at my university, it's a 3-year bachelor degree, and we have 6 periods rather than quarters or semesters or trimesters. Um, Most people take a fourth year, which is technically a master's, but it's kind of like the fourth year of a bachelor's in the US. Tuition is noticeably different. So in the Netherlands, I think that our bachelor tuition is something like 2,800 euros per year
Mm,
if you come from the EU. And our master's tuition, I think, is 5,000 per year.
mm.
Um,
A financial
yeah,
burden. Financial burden.
yeah, it's quite a bit different. So I would
Sarcasm.
vastly prefer my son to attend a European or a Dutch university to a US one when he gets to be that age.
Yeah, Germany is free. Yeah.
I would imagine the funding for scientific research is also more forthcoming there, or is it as bad as it is here in the US?
Um, I don't know about the proportion of proposals that are funded through the Dutch National Science Foundation versus the US National Science Foundation, but there's certainly been austerity recently. There have been budgetary issues in European countries similar to those in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them have been caused by common kind of political movements in the US versus the Netherlands. But also there have been some constraints with economic recovery after the pandemic in Europe versus the US.
Mm. And you were there for the pandemic, yeah.
I was here for the pandemic, and that was an interesting experience, both research
Yeah.
wise, which we can
Yeah,
get to in a little
exactly. Yeah,
bit,
yeah, yeah.
but also personally. I really learned Dutch well during the pandemic. So I'd already been in the Netherlands for 8 years, and I'd taken several courses and had some Dutch competence, but I really focused on language education and followed the news a lot during that period. And also living in a very urban and walkable environment. My wife and I would take 45-minute walks to the city every night. And it was like being in that scene in the movie 28 Days Later when the main character, Jim, leaves his hospital and there's just no one in downtown London. It was exactly like that in Dam Square in Amsterdam, where you just wouldn't see another human being, where typically you'd see hundreds of people during the middle of the day.
Yeah, like a CGI'd post-apocalyptic scene. Yeah.
It was also the first time that I'd really, I don't know if regret is quite the right word, but I lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico for 7 years, which just has incredible skies, mountains, landscapes. And I really regretted not being able to just get in my car and drive somewhere.
Yeah.
An urban environment felt a little bit more like a prison. And of
Mm.
course, there were, I think that the term lockdown is used very sloppily to refer to a lot of things that are not the same. But we did have curfews and a lot of restaurants and bars were closed. So options for social and just recreational activities were pretty limited.
Yeah. David, you were in
Well,
LA. You were in LA for that.
I was, yeah. Also, things were locked down. It was a bummer for everyone. It was, it was dark times. But I want to transition into your research because, um,
Because everyone's like, no, tell us more about what it's like to walk through Amsterdam.
yeah,
That's
let's
why
just remember how bad it was during
strolls
the
through.
pandemic.
Yeah, exactly.
So like you actually, as far as I'm aware, you have done some of the best and highest sample size research on the effects of pandemics on our psychology. And also you're one of the foremost experts on disgust and contamination psychology. And so here you are in the middle of a pandemic. You have this huge sample size of studying people's attitudes throughout the pandemic, both, before it really peaked and after. And you have this huge, awesome data set. I remember seeing some of your slides at HBES and was really impressed by it. And I would just love to get some of the takeaways from that project because I found it really interesting at the time I saw it at HBES, and I'd love a recap of it.
Yeah, sure. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I was contacted by a lot of journalists because there aren't that many researchers who specialize in the psychology of pathogen avoidance. And then all of a sudden, there's a once in a generation or multiple generation pandemic. And they wanted my insights into how human psychology was going to change as a function of COVID-19. And initially, I was very skeptical that we would see many changes that had any kind of correspondence with our functionally specialized pathogen avoidance psychology.
Hmm.
Nevertheless, I felt like it would be a good idea to start collecting some data. And so I partnered with a local panel research company in the Netherlands called Flycatcher. And I started with, gosh, I think our first sample was 1,000 individuals. And we collected data during, let's see, I think that it was May of 2020. So just about the peak period of deaths and ICU occupancy in the Netherlands. And we had a plan to just collect data every 9 months or so, as long as necessary until the pandemic was over. And the goal was to assess some variables that psychologists have said relate to our motivations to avoid infectious disease. I can list some of these. One of them is disgust sensitivity. So, as you and listeners are probably aware, some people are more easily disgusted by bad smells and, just based on our folk psychology, gross things than others. And researchers have often tied variation in how easily disgusted you are to your motivations to avoid pathogen cues. So we measured that across the pandemic. We measured attitudes toward outgroups. So there's a literature suggesting that part of our psychology of intergroup biases and negativity toward outgroups reflects adaptations for avoiding pathogens, with the idea that in our ancestral history, outgroups have posed a greater pathogen threat than ingroups. And we assessed a variable that I've been assessing in several studies over the last 5 years that we just refer to as contact comfort. So it's not how disgusted you are by pathogen cues, but rather how comfortable you would be with indirect contact with another person. So an example is if Dave P, you take a big swig out of a Dasani bottle and you offer it to Dave other P. I just made that mistake that all of you guests do.
Right here, look at this.
San Pellegrino. Okay, if Pinsoff takes a swig out of a San Pellegrino bottle and offers it to Pietraszewski, how comfortable are you with that, Pietraszewski? Would you feel comfortable?
How comfortable
doing
are
that?
you, Dave?
Well, I have a cold right now, so yeah,
Oh.
you know.
All right, you get pass.
And then we also asked them about their explicit concerns about disease. So items here are, I'm concerned about getting an infectious disease right now. And we could track how these variables relate to each other, but also how they changed across these assessments during the pandemic to see if early on in the pandemic, when disease is very salient, there's press conferences weekly or so in the Netherlands, there's lockdowns, people are worried about dying and about their parents dying. They don't want to get close to each other because they're worried about these pathogens transmitted by invisible respiratory droplets and aerosols. If then these variables that we think reflect pathogen avoidance motivations are changing with the intensity of the pandemic. So ultimately, we had 4 assessments every 9 months starting in 2020 and ending in 2022 when the World Health Organization had declared that the pandemic was complete.
And what did you find from this massive undertaking?
We found 0 differences in most of these variables. So disgust sensitivity did not change across the pandemic. This was actually a little bit contrary to some early papers that were pushed out very early in the pandemic, but were kind of small sample size, and we're just looking at what a mean was here and what a mean on another sample was that had been pulled out of the literature. Since we could follow our participants across time, we had a very high-powered study for detecting fairly small effect sizes. And we didn't see that, when people were very worried about disease and they were getting cues to, at least socially transmitted cues to there being threats posed by disease, we didn't see that they were more disgusted by mold or bad smells or sores or anything like that. We also saw no differences in anti-immigrant bias across the pandemic. So when people were explicitly saying, yes, I'm quite worried about disease, they were no more negative toward immigrants than when they weren't as concerned. Now, I just skipped it a little bit. When we did ask them their kind of reflective concerns about disease, I'm worried about getting sick right now, we saw very large effect sizes. Yes, people were consciously worried about disease early, not late, but that didn't correspond with then greater anti-immigrant bias. Maybe most interestingly, there was no change in contact comfort. So people weren't saying, I'm less comfortable sharing a water bottle with someone, even when health authorities were saying, you really don't want to be doing this. On the self-report instruments, they were no less comfortable early in the pandemic than late in the pandemic. And that might seem counterintuitive, but if you actually saw behavior during the pandemic, some people were, consciously worried about things. But when I would go out in public, the majority of people were disregarding most of these recommendations. They were not keeping in Europe, their 1.5 meters, or I don't know if it was 6 feet in the US, and they were rushing out to bars and restaurants when they were opened again. So I'll leave that there. If you have any follow-up questions, then I can explain something else that was interesting that we found.
Is the idea that the stable, were there are there stable individual differences in these things that what were already in the literature and that you found again?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's high test retest reliability for these measures.
Okay.
So if you look at the interclass correlation coefficient in the multi-level model that we used, you have a very high ICC reflecting stable individual differences. Yeah.
Got it. So if, I sit down in a chair and it's still warm from the previous person, I find that gross, somebody else doesn't. Whether or not we're in a pandemic, I'm going to still find it gross. The other person still isn't. So the idea is that the individual stable differences wash away any effect there might have been from the overarching pandemic cues. Is that the general idea?
That's right. And any effect there might have been, again, we had very high power to detect very small effects, and
Mm,
we didn't even detect those.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then did you find any within correlations? So like within a cohort, say, between one of your 9 month separations or whatever, did you find correlations between, say, disgust sensitivity and anti-immigrant sentiment, or fear of disease and anti-immigrant sentiment, or anything like that?
Yeah, we replicated these effects. So
Okay.
individuals who are higher in disgust sensitivity are more negative toward immigrants. Pretty
Okay.
small effect size, but we did detect that. Yes.
And
Okay.
what is, if I can just push on that for a second, what's the logic? You talked a little bit about the logic, but can we unpack that? Because I think one of the reasons why people find the behavioral immune system stuff interesting is number one, it's just interesting to think about psychological adaptations for avoiding disease. But number two, I think there's been an argument that it has a host of concomitant effects that might seem sort of irrational from a naive or maybe standard social science model to be sort of coalitional about EvPsych. Can you either unpack like what's the logic of avoiding outgroups, and is this a real, in your opinion, like what's up with that? And can you just talk more about that for people who may not know?
Absolutely. And I'll take a circuitous route to doing that and hopefully not monologue or lecture too much
No,
because I
it's
think
great.
that this is a
Please. Yeah.
really interesting topic. So there's a social psychologist, evolutionary psychologist named Mark Schaller, who really pioneered this area. And Mark wrote a nice chapter in Buss's Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology, in which he described the behavioral immune system as an evolutionary success story. And when Mark first started working on this stuff in the early aughts, I was only familiar with a couple papers that engaged with the psychology of disease and disease avoidance. Most of it was looking at attitudes toward gay men in the 1990s because they were explicitly associated with HIV, and
Mm.
researchers thought this might underlie part of anti-gay prejudice. And then the evolutionary psychologists Rob Kurzban and co-author Mark Leary wrote a classic paper that really kind of got me thinking about evolutionary psychology in 2001 on stigmatization. And they proposed that one of three reasons explaining general stigmatization processes in humans is parasite avoidance. Regardless, Mark Schaller, being a social psychologist largely interested in prejudice, started thinking, well, people kind of have aversions to a lot of individuals for seemingly irrational reasons. So birthmarks, physical disability, just looking different than other people. And a lot of theories in social psychology have difficulty in explaining that. And so he started proposing that a lot of this might be our specialized pathogen avoidance psychology treating features of different individuals in our social environments as diagnostic of an increased infection risk.
Mm.
Now, this again is something that if you're not thinking about evolution and what our minds should be designed to do, you really have a tough time coming to that hypothesis. And if we unpack that a little bit further, in talks I give on this topic, I often give a picture of this really cool looking virus, a bacterial phage. And phages are specialized for infecting bacterial cells. So some bacteria that infect humans, like E. coli, they're actually infected by these viral cells. And what this suggests is that pathogens have been a problem for life on Earth pretty much as long as life on Earth has existed. And they should be one of the most important factors in shaping the evolution of life. And we should expect a lot of complex adaptations for this problem in all animals, and specifically, what we're interested in as psychologists, humans. Now, if we think about all of the things that humans have to do that have non-zero disease risks, well, eating puts things in our mouths. We often need to touch our food with our hands, which are coming into contact with other things that are pathogen risks. Having sex requires close proximity and contact with someone else. And evolutionary psychologists have pointed out that sex is pretty important and make preferences for understanding the mind. Basic social interactions. So touching things that other people have touched. So exchanging artifacts or physical contact for cooperative interactions. Interacting with animals, either as food or with dogs. And the list goes on, child rearing. And so by unlocking better knowledge about how our minds have evolved to deal with pathogens, to detect them and then manage the threats posed by them, we should be able to make inroads in a lot of different research areas in evolutionary psychology. So that's kind of the pitch for why this is important. Let me stop there for a second before we go on to the outgroup thing, just to see if you guys have any questions or comments.
No, it's a wonderful tour of the history of this thinking, and I'm eager to get to the punchline of, what is real here, and what was a wrong turn.
Yeah, and I just want to say too, before to interrupt, it's also a great example of, it reminds me of Annie Wertz's plant work where, people are like, oh, that's weird that there's like psychological stuff for pathogen avoidance, or Annie with plants. But then and that's from a very like ivory tower, like the purpose of cognition is thinking. You don't think about the embodied physical environment or nature really at all. But if you come from this other perspective, yeah, like pathogens have been around forever. I mean, there's arguments that the evolution of sex is because of pathogens, right? And something like plants or pathogens, it's the prior for there being lots of adaptations for these things is so high. So I just love this idea that you're taking a thing that is sort of counterintuitive from this very narrow perspective, but really there's really good evidence or arguments or logic for why it would be. So I think it's just a good example of the argument of taking an evolutionary approach, providing a novel, different way of thinking about things. But that's just my commentary before we proceed.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. So when we get to outgroups, I'll also say that in this research area, there were a lot of exciting hypotheses early on. And then, as is the case with all kind of generative and productive scientific enterprises, there's pruning, and then there's more generation, and then there's further pruning. And there's not an absolute consensus in this area. I think that you could have guests that might disagree with some of my perspective, but I'll give you mine here. Some of the early work in this area by Mark Schaller, by really, really smart people like Dan Fessler, Carlos Navarrete, also Randy Thornhill, a lot of it was focused on this idea of outgroup biases and prejudices having something to do with pathogen avoidance. And the authors that I just mentioned, some of them have slightly different perspectives on this. But I'll give you the account from the parasite stress model, which has some commonalities with other accounts. The idea here is that people specialize their immune responses to pathogens in their local ecologies. And the pathogens in different ecologies are going to be different. And so if you have two groups that live, let's say, on two different sides of a mountain or across an ocean, they're going to develop some immunity based on their exposure to specific pathogens in their ecologies. And so the average interaction with someone from your ecology who shares some immunity to the type of pathogens there, that's going to be less of a threat to you, simply because you have some immunity to the pathogens that that person is going to transmit to you if you're shaking their hand or eating food with them or something like that. However, if you have an interaction with a person on the other side of that mountain who has exposure to different pathogens that you might not have some adaptive immunity toward, that interaction is going to be more likely to infect you with something that has higher costs for you. And those costs could ultimately be death, but of course, pathogens is not you die or you don't die. There are metabolic costs. You could infect social partners or kin. There could be phenotypic differences that lead you to be stigmatized. You have less time and energy to hunt, to invest in friends, all sorts of bad things with infection. So the idea here is that the mind might have evolved to treat outgroup membership as a cue to pathogens, or at least to the infectiousness or the danger of pathogens to you. And hence, we should see these relations between disgust sensitivity and outgroup biases. So the individuals who, when they see pathogen cues, they feel more disgusted. Their affective systems are basically investing more in avoidance in response to these cues than the people who are low on disgust sensitivity. Those high disgust sensitivity individuals should be more biased against outgroups. We should see greater intergroup biases in parts of the world with a higher concentration of parasites, et cetera. So that's the argument. And there are a lot of studies that have been interpreted as supporting that argument. I have personally been skeptical of that argument for a few reasons. And part of this might be my background in social psychology as it is. And Dave Pietrzewski, given that you're interested in groups and group psychology, you might have some thoughts to add to this as well. One is that the psychology of groups has very little overlap with ecological origin. And this perspective really is centered around people come from different ecologies that have different pathogens. So the minimal group paradigm, which was developed in the 1970s, demonstrates that if you just get a bunch of strangers in a room and you tell half of them that they are people who favor the artist Klee and the other half that they favor the artist Kandinsky, you can get these manifestations of intergroup biases. The erasing race work, and Dave, your other work on alliance detections and the who said what paradigm, suggests that the way that group membership is encoded based on phenotypic features is kind of flexible and probably tracking coalitions more so than it's tracking ecological origins. And the work by Toshio Yamagishi and others that kind of follows up on minimal group paradigm studies suggests that these perceptions, or at least behaviors of intergroup biases, are really tracking assumptions of interdependence. So kind of first principle aspects of this account leave me skeptical that we would actually be treating outgroup members per se as cues to pathogens.
Yeah.
I'll pause there in case, yeah.
Yeah. So I fully agree. I share your skepticism of this hypothesis. And I would add, though, I mean, and this connects to some of your other research, there may be a grain of truth to it, insofar as, any kind of social interaction has some pathogen risk associated with it. And we should have evolved to weigh the costs of those pathogen risks against the potential benefits. And so insofar as you view outgroups as lower value social partners, then the costs of interacting with them may outweigh the benefits. So in that sense, it wouldn't be that you're viewing outgroups as a particularly high pathogen risk and therefore you're avoiding them. It's that you already don't like them for other reasons. And because we evolved to not bear the costs of interacting with people we don't like, then that could contribute to some, say, greater disgust toward outgroups, or disgust might win the battle in terms of the cost benefit analysis of interacting with them. Do you buy that grain of truth story?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a nice segue, Dave. In that, one thing that I've argued for recently is that the majority of our pathogen avoidance psychology in terms of social interactions is based on two things. One of them is, does this person actually have a feature that is diagnostic of infection? And I'm skeptical that things like old age or obesity, some cues that have been proposed when this literature first started developing, are actually treated as diagnostic of being contagious with an infection right then. I would bet, well, maybe not bet money, but reputation, that the cues that people interpret as diagnostic of contagion are really going to be limited to things like oozing sores on the face, things related to skin color, skin texture, irregular dots of color, that type of stuff. So that's going to be one feature that's important in kind of regulating this. Do I take a risk associated with pathogens? How likely is this person that has an infection? One interesting thing about that is that the actual pathogens that infect people now don't need to be the same as the pathogens that infected people 50,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago or 2 million years ago or anything like that. A lot of times what we're responding to is other individuals' immune systems activating. And in fact, some researchers at the Karolinska Institute have this really cool method where they inject their participants with something called lipopolysaccharide. It's like the cell wall of bacteria that cause infections. And when you inject people with it, they're not actually infected, but these cell walls do provoke an innate immune response, high increases in things like interleukin 6, pro-inflammatory cytokines, and they feel really sick for like 6 hours. And so
sign me up. That sounds like an awesome study.
They bring the people to the lab twice, one time with the placebo, one time with the LPS. And yeah, I've spoken with the researchers who do this, and they say, yeah, people pretty much know what condition they're in pretty quickly. But in some of their studies, they've taken photographs of the individuals who have gotten the LPS, and then, at time 2 or time 1, depending on the counterbalanced order, gotten the placebo. And you can really tell which one was the sick one. So just based on internal inflammation, you can detect cues to another person having an immune response. Anyway,
what do you think is it? Because I would imagine a big part of it is they just look really like tired and out of it. Their eyes are probably droopy. I imagine that's part of it, but is there probably skin coloration effects as well, or do we not know what cues they're picking up on?
Oh yeah, I mean, I show this image in my EbSci class that I teach, and everyone loves it. But yeah, they look paler. The eyes look a little puffy. There's a little bit of irregularity in the color. The sclera look a little bit less clear.
And that's just with visual cues, right? Like, I mean, if you know the person, like, I mean, I have a slight cold, like I said, it's like right on time for you. And like, I sound different. I assume a lot of the inflammation of these areas has really, we have a lot of machinery for detecting very subtle acoustic differences. So I think you could, if you know what the person usually sounds like, you can really tell when somebody is like, congested or not. Yeah.
Absolutely. I find this interesting just to think about the number of times that people might say, are you sick? Are you feeling okay? Do you sound...
No, it's allergies. Yeah, no, somebody will be like,
Another evolutionary psychologist, Josh Ackerman, has an interesting research program right now on people concealing whether they're sick, because there could be cost to disclosing that you're infected to other individuals based on how they treat you, opportunities they might give you, et cetera. But regardless, there's this one part of our pathogen avoidance psychology which should be trying to detect or estimate how likely someone is to be contagious right at this moment. The other part is, well, we basically don't know if anyone, we don't have perfect knowledge that people are contagious. And some of these cues can update our estimates that they're contagious, but we're never going to have perfect knowledge. And sometimes infections aren't producing any symptoms at all. Sometimes these symptoms are they could be false alarms in terms of detection. But we do need to take these risks with all individuals who don't necessarily have symptoms. And so we should be calibrating those risks based on things not related to pathogens, but rather based on how beneficial is contact and proximity with this individual, and how much of a cost would I pay to categorize them as posing a pathogen risk to me in the absence of any kind of visual cues. So in one paper that Deb Lieberman and I and Tom Kupfer and some other Leigh Fan and Reinhard Fries published a while ago, we tested this idea that it's one of those ideas where you have a giant effect size and your grandma would know this kind of thing. We just randomly assigned participants to think about a target, and we asked them to think about a target who was either their romantic partner or their closest friend or an acquaintance or an enemy, someone that they know well, but they really can't stand. And we asked them these questions. How comfortable would you be drinking from a water bottle that this person drank from, touching this person's socks after they exercised, taking a bite out of a sandwich that this person had taken a bite out of? So none of them required them to actually touch the person or risk transmitting pathogens to that individual, but basically just touch something they touched and have some risk of pathogens being transmitted to them. And you just get these gigantic effect sizes, even though these individuals have no cues to pathogens that we're aware of. We just ask them to think about this person. And so that's some good evidence that people are calibrating their pathogen avoidance tendencies for specific individuals based on how important that person is to them. But we further propose that within these folk categories, there should be variation in how much you value that relationship with that target. So Dave Pinsoff, you might value your best friend more than Dave Pietrzewski, you value your best friend. Or you might value the acquaintance that you think of more than Dave Pietrzewski values the acquaintance that he thinks of. So we also administered something called a welfare trade-off task, something developed by Dave Pietrzewski. You probably went to grad school with Andy Delton and Tess Robertson. You were probably there at the same time. Yep. But this is developed from the UCSB group. And if there are psychologists in the audience, this is very similar to something called social value orientation, but it's target specific. But effectively, what you assess is the proportion of benefit that you would be willing to give up for a target to get some benefit. So said differently, across 10 trials, I could ask you 10 questions where Dave Pietrzewski always gets $30. And Dave Pinsoff is asked, well, would you rather get $80 or Dave Pietrzewski get 30? Would you rather get 60 or Dave Pietrzewski get 30, et cetera, et cetera? And based on the point at which they start saying, well, I'll give up the benefit for Dave Pietrzewski to get that benefit, you can estimate the ratio of the target's welfare relative to your own that you're willing to give up. So with that kind of long-winded explanation for what this task is out of the way, we find these really consistent correlations also within these kind of folk categories, that people who value their closest friend more are also more comfortable with these pathogen risks. And at a bivariate level, if you just look at welfare trade-off ratio and contact comfort, the correlation coefficient is like 0.7. It's insanely large. And then we replicated this over multiple studies. We even tried it where we gave photos of strangers and we described them with the personality traits high in honesty, humility, and agreeableness, or low in honesty, humility, and agreeableness. And these are personality traits that meta-analyses show predict cooperation in anonymous interactions between strangers. So amount of money you give in a prisoner's dilemma, for example. And we see the same thing.
So you see the same thing in that context, meaning even with a stranger, you're more likely to tolerate disease from them if they're higher on these traits.
That's correct.
I'm more willing to share a drink with a nice guy than with an asshole. And it's interesting that we use that term asshole because it itself elicits disgust. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So looping back to the COVID study, this was one thing that we replicated strongly within that COVID study. So at the 4 different time points that we surveyed participants, we randomly assigned them to have a different target and assessed welfare trade-off ratio across those times. And we see that within participant as well as between participants. So if you ask the same person to think about different targets, at 9 months apart, you have this really strong relationship that, yes, an individual, when they think of someone who they have a higher interpersonal value for, they're more comfortable taking these infection risks just based on touching things that another person has touched than someone that they have a low interpersonal value for.
I mean, this seems bad for the generic outgroup hypothesis in the sense of you're getting sensitivity on these measures to other things that sort of from first principles you would expect. So like relationship. Yeah, I mean, so it seems like a problem, but is there an argument to steelman that hypothesis? Is it the argument that it's specific kinds of groups, or how it sounds really bad for the group pathogen idea?
So with my former PhD student, Annika Karnen, we have another paper in which this was a registered report where you have hypotheses peer reviewed before the data are published or before the results are known. But we randomly assigned participants to read about an immigrant that was either really low on assimilation or really high on assimilation. And we also had another, it was crossed with this in the vignette. They're really high in contact or low in contact. So they were either living in kind of a ghetto with other immigrants, or they were really integrating in town. They're really adopting the local norms, or they were really keeping the norms of their home country. We did see that disgust sensitivity was related to anti-immigrant attitudes when they were not assimilating. but they were not related to the anti-immigrant attitudes when they are assimilating. So I think this ties back into the other account well, in that the assimilation might be a cue for being a valuable interactions partner. When they're not assimilating, then you're getting the people who are higher in disgust sensitivity, who are really like, I really don't want that person around me. And so you could still have people varying on their trait level pathogen avoidance. And depending on how they're framing that immigrant in terms of being a likely benefit socially versus not, you could get this relationship.
So to summarize, if I'm hearing you right, it's that it's not that the pathogen system is sort of overriding the social valuation system. It's that the social valuation system is sort of tracking, is this somebody worth interacting with? Is it a friend? Is it somebody who I'm going to get benefits from? What's the likely forecast of social value? And then if that's already low, then all of the problems or cons of interacting with that person anyway are just going to be like the excuse or come to the fore. And one of those cons might be pathogen. But it sounds like, roughly speaking, that's the order. Is that a fair characterization of the literature as you see it?
Um, yes, although I think that this idea of outgroups being categorized as a pathogen threat is still prevalent in the literature. So of course, I'm giving you my read, which is shaped by my data, but I would be curious how others generally look at this. Now, there is another issue, though, and Dave Pinsoff, I know that you mentioned this. Maybe it was in your podcast with Deb Lieberman. Some other work on pathogen avoidance and sexual strategies. So there's another finding that's been prevalent in the literature, and that is that largely in US samples, although there's some cross-cultural data that support this as well, individuals who are higher in disgust sensitivity tend to be more politically conservative. So they score higher on measures of right-wing authoritarianism and traditionalism, and just self-identification as liberal versus conservative, especially on social issues. And again, the argument for this relation has really tied back to intergroup interactions for the most part, suggesting that those who are more invested in avoiding pathogens should find these right-wing ideologies more appealing because they interrupt intergroup interactions and they're anti-immigrant and that type of stuff. For the same reasons that I articulated earlier, that there are some reasons to be skeptical of that account. My colleagues, including Yoel Imbar and Catherine Mulho and I, suggested that maybe this could be a byproduct of something else, namely sexual strategies, in that having kind of more permissive reproductive lifestyles or reproductive strategies exposes people to higher pathogen threats. So people need to kind of weigh how valuable is having a less restricted sexual life to me, relative to the higher pathogen costs imposed by that lifestyle. And this need not just to be what we call sexually transmitted infections, which are called that because they are transmitted via sex specifically. So they infect largely genitals and are transmitted via genitals. But if you can get the flu by standing in a room with someone, you can get the flu by having sex with them. And so individuals who are especially invested in avoiding pathogens, they might actually select reproductive strategies that lower that risk of pathogen transmission. And once you have a specific reproductive strategy, certain political ideologies are more favorable versus disfavorable to those strategies. So, of course, this is in line with David Pinsoff. You've probably discussed some of this on one of these podcasts. But conservative ideologies, they're often disincentivizing these more unrestricted type of sexual lifestyles. So they're making it harder to get abortions, access to birth control. They're moralizing pornography and hookups and that type of stuff. And so you might get this relation where you have more pathogen avoidant individuals. They select these specific sexual strategies, and then based on sexual strategies, people sort into these political coalitions partially. And so this bivariate relation between pathogen avoidance and political values might be operating through these sexual strategies. And that's what we find. And over, if you ask people how disgusted they are by sexual things, and you ask them how disgusted they are by pathogen things, there's no independent relation between how disgusted they are by the pathogen things and political values once you control for the sexual disgust.
Some of that original work too, my understanding was it didn't really replicate. So some of the like John Hibbing, for example, I remember he came to UCSB when I was a graduate student, and presented a lot of work on conservatives being more disgust prone. But that was sort of during the days of John was a lovely person, and I know he's retired now, so I can say like I'm not sure how much that stuff holds up. What is your understanding of that? It sounds
The
like you guys replicate some of it, or at least that like if there is a difference, it's driven through this sexual path.
So this is quite robust, actually.
Okay.
Just the self-reports of disgust sensitivity relating to the self-reports of political ideology.
Hmm.
What John Hibbing and others have published that is not replicable is largely, I believe, psychophysiological measures.
Okay.
So, they were looking at conservatives versus liberals in threat reactivity, using
Yes.
things like galvanic skin
Yes.
response,
Yes.
et cetera. And multiple researchers, Ev and Eva, in the Ev community have contributed to this, basically suggesting that a lot of what these methods are assessing is noise,
Mm.
and papers publishing these findings have capitalized on noisy data
Yeah.
at best.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for clarifying that. What is your bottom line take on like wrapping this aspect up? How important is this behavioral immune system idea from there's two ways I understood like broadly, and maybe this is an oversimplification. One is you have to deal with the fact that pathogens exist while making a social living. And there's another one that sort of says pathogens really matter a lot more for your social choices than you might think, even in terms of like interacting with somebody. So the first one is sort of like, well, yeah, we make our decisions about social partners and then we just deal with the fact that sometimes they're sick or not. The other one is sort of saying, no, you actually really choose your social partners even based on cues of illness. Are both right in different contexts, or is one really wrong, or is that a wrong dichotomy?
No, I think that they're both right. The thing is that individuals get sick all the time. So, of
Right.
course, you have long term social relationships, and you don't just abandon someone when they're sick. I mean, that could happen,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's
but generally you don't. And I mean, one thing that all three of us have in common, we all have young children, and of course, child rearing takes a lot, puts you at a risk of a lot of infections, and of course, that's exacerbated in modern contexts with indoor air sharing and respiratory viruses in daycare. There is something to kind of short-term interactions with strangers, where we might kind of approach specific individuals for those types of interactions differently depending on whether they're infectious. And of course, we could try to manage the infection risk by individuals when they do have cues to infection, even if
right.
they're close to us. But yes, I would say that pathogens, huge problem, impact all sorts of aspects of our social psychology and our food psychology and our mating psychology, et cetera. And we are going to be able to tell to a degree which people are sick when. But even in the absence of those cues, we're still going to be assuming a non-zero pathogen transmission risk, just because humans are the most likely things to infect us, even in the absence of things that we can detect.
Right. Cool. Yeah. And so one
Yeah.
of the things we've talked about before and I think it was, I forget which episode, was that something like sex, it might have been with Deb Lieberman, was that, given that this pathogen avoidance is a primary thing in our psychology, then as you say, certain other co-adaptations or other adaptations will co-vary the disgust sensitivity when there's a benefit. So for example, like sex should turn down disgust. Parenting, like I don't know about you guys, but like my child is the one person where I'm like, I don't even care what happens to me. I don't want to get them sick, but like if they're sick, whatever, like I don't care at all. At least that's my experience. So has there been work in mating or parenting on the turning down of disgust sensitivity, which you would expect like there to be really big effects for?
Yeah, it's difficult to do this work well. I would say that those things are absolutely true. It's so has to be true based on your priors and based on your lived experience.
Hmm.
That
Yeah.
I don't know if the way that a social science study comes out should inform how we're thinking about that much. But I can comment on the little research that's been done with parenting. There is a study in which some researchers in Australia, Dick Stevenson, Trevor Case, and others, asked parents to imagine how disgusted they would be by their own baby's diaper versus other people's baby's diapers.
Hmm.
And they said that they'd be more disgusted by other people's baby's diapers. And then they had a smell test where parents actually did a blind diaper smelling test.
Oh, that sounds like a fun
Um,
study
Yeah,
to look at.
these are like the real hits of like so in this
um,
study you
and
will be smelling diapers. Some of them
the finding reported is that parents find their own baby's diapers smell to be less aversive, even when they don't know it's their own baby's diaper. The replicability of that, I can't say based on the
Yeah.
sample size and the methods at the time. But I'm not familiar with other research on the topic. One PhD student and I are about to launch a big study that I'm kind of excited about, looking at these same variables of contact comfort, but having the child be the target, and then sampling people who have children who are a bunch of different ages to see if this is invariant across child's age or if this is kind of dialed to the dependency of the child on you.
Mm.
So stay tuned. We might have some interesting results at some point. In terms of mating, there's a similar issue in that it's both difficult methodologically and then also questioning whether the method that you're using actually tracks with the question that you want to be asking. So there's a famous and perhaps infamous study by Dan Ariely in which he asked participants to masturbate while they were completing questionnaires. And they said that they were willing to do all sorts of disgusting things in the participants were masturbating condition more than in the other condition. There are other aspects of that study that maybe make you question what you can take from it. And then there are various studies in which participants have watched erotic videos or had guided visualizations, and then you ask them to do disgusting things. And some studies have found that, yes, that's the case. People are willing to do more disgusting things. But this is a broader issue in these kinds of approaches of what can broadly be described as priming, which is, should you actually expect the system to be designed so that you're in a state of sexual arousal and you're just indiscriminately more open to exposure to pathogens versus should this be really targeted toward
Right.
whatever is eliciting that sexual arousal and
Mm,
targeted toward the specific types of pathogen risks that are necessary for sex.
Mm.
yeah.
So, of course, it's an open question how the system is designed, but it would be a pretty blunt design feature to say, okay, I'm in a state of sexual arousal. I'm going to eat that yogurt that is expired 2 months ago. Not impossible.
Happens all the time.
Yeah.
This could be a byproduct depending on how
Yeah.
general the system is.
Yeah.
Uh, but I would guess that it has better design features than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love the way you're thinking about this. And in many ways, what you're discovering is that the system is smarter than we thought it was. And that people, in their first pass at sort of laying out the design features of this system, they sort of underestimated just how sophisticated and well designed it in fact is. That we're not just indiscriminately viewing anyone from a quote unquote outgroup as a pathogen threat or anyone who quote unquote looks different as a pathogen threat, that the system is actually more subtle and sophisticated than this. It's actually using valid cues to pathogen risk. And most of the decision making variance is going to be explained by more subtle calculations of social valuation. And that if the disease risk is held constant, then the main source of variance is going to be how valuable I find you or someone else as a social partner, and whether those costs are going to be worth incurring to get the benefits of the social relationship. So I think it's really outstanding work and a huge leap forward to think about this system in terms of this logic. I also think it sheds a lot of light on rituals and signals of affiliation. So around the world, we have handshakes, hugs, kissing on the cheek, These are ways that we signal affiliation with a group of people. And if I refuse a handshake or refuse to hug or like step back when you're trying to hug me, that could be viewed as insulting, and rightly so. And I think your theory explains why these are such common signals of social affiliation. They are, in fact, costly signals. You are incurring a slight cost of pathogen risk in order to signal that you value a relationship with someone. And so it is no coincidence that around the world we have contact rituals as signals of affiliation. And it's also, honestly, I've been thinking, I have a pet theory about sort of quote unquote kinky sexual practices that I think also fits in with your theorizing, which is that um, if pathogen risk can be a costly signal of affiliation, it might be that um, doing disgusting things sexually can be a costly signal of sexual arousal. So if sexual arousal dials down your disgust, then if you're willing to do really gross things in the bedroom, then that is a hard to fake signal that you truly are aroused. And insofar as there is an arms race between, figuring out if someone is truly aroused versus faking it, if they're willing to do disgusting things, then that could be a hard to fake signal that they truly are aroused. And the same thing goes for potentially dangerous things in the bedroom, like BDSM stuff. If sexual arousal requires you to dial down your fear, then if you're willing to do dangerous things like getting handcuffed or choked or whatever, then that is a hard to fake signal of sexual arousal. Anyway, that's my pet theory about what might explain uh, some of these practices. I'm curious if you buy it or not.
I look forward to the BBS paper.
Well,
No, that sounds really interesting. I mean,
yeah.
this is you point out something that for evolutionary psychologists, this is a mystery. Why are these types of things prominent across cultures? Of course, there are a minority of individuals. As a brief aside, I've also done some behavioral genetics work, and I've collaborated with a researcher in Finland who runs the genetics of sexuality and aggression database. So he has population level data on BDSM practices,
Mm,
and it's a fairly small amount of the population in his data that
mhm,
reports engaging in these. But that small proportion is present in Finland, present in Germany, present in the Netherlands, present in the US, present in Japan, et cetera. And presumably via independent kind of pathways popping up. This probably isn't something that's just culturally transmitted from one source to all of these different locations. And of course, individuals develop these preferences and practices within their own relationships, and they're not probably broadcasting broadly their desires or their practices to do this. So it demands some kind of explanation. And I think that I tentatively buy it. I mean, it
mhm.
sounds compelling what you say. Definitely, I think that their costly signaling has some kind of explanation to play in it.
Mhm.
David, can I just poke
Yeah,
on this idea,
sure.
which is that is an alternative, because the way I had been thinking about it is like just this is not my area, but just sort of
Yeah.
as like, an amateur, was that there's just individual differences already in sort of like aggressiveness or proneness to pathogen sensitivity or not. And then if you're getting this human universal of when sexually aroused, certain things get turned up or down, whatever the state of these other systems are in people, like some people are just lower in disgust sensitivity to begin with, or when they're sexually aroused, they're really sexually aroused, or the relationship between the sexual arousal system and the disgust system is just really stronger in some people, just as
Mhm.
just a distribution. I mean, it's sort of
Sure.
boring that you would get, oh, the disgust sensitivity is so low in some people, and there's just like a market for sort of I don't know how to put it, but just yeah, I mean, the byproduct of just sort of like the disgust sensitivity is so low, with the caveat of Josh that it's not going to be like I'm eating stale yogurt or something or expired yogurt. But is that a different account, or is your account that there's sort of more functionality, that it's a signal or a cue of that's sort of in the marketplace of like I'm more aroused by you than this other person?
Yeah, so I would make the prediction that people who engage in kinky practices will be judged as more aroused than people who are not engaged in kinky practices. And if we're trying to, say, estimate the probability that someone's faking an orgasm, I would predict that a person who is engaged in a kinky practice would be viewed as less likely to have, say, faked the orgasm. And so I would view it as a costly signal. And because we are aroused by our partner's arousal itself, then those costly signals should be arousing to us because they're signaling to us in a hard to fake way that our partner is aroused, and we should be aroused by our partner's arousal. And that can create a kind of feedback loop where each partner is aroused by the other's arousal, which is, they're aroused by our arousal, and so forth. And so, for that reason, kinky practices can create mutual arousal through this signaling function. And so, if it's just random variation, I wouldn't necessarily expect it to take on this signaling
Right,
function.
right.
Yeah.
And the argument then is maybe, and this is like obvious when you say it out loud, but
Yeah.
it's that there's design for sexual receptivity in the partner.
Yes.
And that's the primary target of sort of like, this is how aroused I am. And there's design for gauging that, which makes sense, right? For lots of reasons.
Yes, exactly. So the argument isn't that kinky practices themselves are adaptations, it's they're a byproduct of systems for gauging partner
Mm,
sexual arousal and avoiding sexual deception and trying to accurately gauge arousal and in turn calibrating your own arousal to estimates of your partner's arousal. And kinky practices emerge as a byproduct uh, of those um, of those systems of trying to gauge arousal or not. And they
right.
emerge perhaps in cultures where that are more sexually liberal in
Mhm.
terms of norms and what have you. And then they probably are less likely to emerge where um, sex is more taboo, I guess. Yeah.
Cool. Josh, this is a slight change of topic, but it's still in the neighborhood, do you ever encounter people when they're talking to you or misunderstanding or understanding your theories? I think to some people it might sound sort of reductive that, well, the reason why we have these adaptations is because of pathogens. Like I think, like that we prefer to think, well, it's like something like David's, like ideology, right? Sort of the idea that sort of anything is driven by pathogen avoidance. How do humans view that idea? And I can imagine two things. One is some people pushing against it because they're like, why does our highfalutin psychology care about something so lowbrow as disease? But then another version would be like, yeah, it's good that we don't like outgroups because they're riddled with pathogens and like lice and like obviously that's like rhetoric of xenophobia. So like have you brushed up against either of those reactions where one is sort of like, how dare you contaminate the ivory tower with disease? We need to worry about that. We're doing math and science. And then the other version is like, you know, racist xenophobia that uses disease, as a cudgel.
So I'll give a brief anecdote about a social psychologist named Paul Rosen, who was maybe the first and most well-known disgust researcher. In a paper he wrote in, I think, the 1980s, he commented on how no one was researching disgust. And it might be because when you tell people you research disgust, they draw some really weird inferences about you.
Yeah.
Why would you study that?
Yeah.
You have to be thinking about these weird things. It's kind of like responses to people who work in a morgue or something like
Mhm.
that, undertakers. And I've experienced that a little bit. So not talking about pathogens is actually a little bit less of that reaction. But if you say you research disgust or you're interested in disgust, you do get some weird looks. That said, relative to evolutionary psychologists who study mating or maybe even politics, I think that I found very little pushback. I think that people are very open to the idea that we have specialized aspects of our psychology for navigating pathogens. I think that it's not controversial or offensive or butting up against other kinds of priors or ways of looking at the world or science in the way that some of these other topics are. It seems orthogonal to a lot of other theoretical approaches within social psychology. And I think people find it both, a part of it has to be true, B, important, and C, perfectly compatible without stepping on any toes. So in terms of evolutionary psychologists sometimes getting some resistance in terms of scientific ideological or political ideological reasons, I really have experienced very little of that in my career.
Cool. And then the other half was like the sort of cudgel of racists, pathogens sort of thing. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I haven't run into too many racists that I'm aware of, or at least I haven't I haven't gotten pushback from perspectives that might be motivated by seeing races as differentially clean or wanting to uphold the idea that there's something essential in our categorization of races or groups that does have some correspondence with a real threat like pathogens. I know those people are out there, but they haven't really engaged in my research so much, and I haven't had conversations with them.
Yeah. Cool.
I was just going to ask about some other areas of discussed research that may not be holding up so well. Like the idea that we're grossed out by, say, fat people or old people or people with physical deformities or abnormalities that make them look different or weird. The idea there, presumably, is that this is a kind of dumb pathogen avoidance system, and we're just kind of being grossed out by anyone who deviates from species typical proportions or whatever. I am skeptical of that. It seems like a pretty dumb way to design a pathogen avoidance system. But I think what might be going on there is that the reason why we're grossed out by, say, physical abnormalities is that what it's really cueing is low social value, or perhaps the expectation that others will view the person as low social value, and that is driving the disgust response. Do you buy that way of thinking of it?
I do.
Yeah.
I should say that some of these hypotheses were generated in the mid to late aughts,
Hmm.
the obesity and
Yeah.
the elderly. And there was some preliminary evidence published consistent with that, but again,
Yeah.
with methods that were kind of standard for the time.
Yeah.
And those ideas, I think, have really stuck around in the literature, but based pretty much only on some studies that don't provide the most diagnostic evidence for the hypothesis, I would say.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's not been a lot of recent research looking at pathogen avoidance and obesity. I would guess to the extent to which there is a kind of pathogen avoidance response toward people with those features, it is based on social value or the idea that in certain ecologies, obesity is associated with other features that people interpret as diagnostic of infection. So we talked about the kind of skin coloration differences that correspond with inflammatory responses in laboratory experiments. If you're in the US and people with a BMI of 35, they might be in settings where they're not getting a lot of physical activity, which affects vascular health. They're not eating a lot of nutrient-rich foods, which can affect, I forget the name, carotenes, something with carotenes that can affect the type of skin coloration that people find attractive in mates and social partners and take as diagnostic to metabolic condition potentially,
Yeah.
and maybe also contagiousness. That there you might have something where you're treating BMI or obesity as a cue to infection. Whereas if you're in some foraging society and you have someone of a similar BMI, they're only going to maintain that if they're getting a lot of nutrients and if they're in fairly good condition and able to resist and have high tolerance for pathogens.
Hmm.
So I wouldn't rule out the possibility that there is something where some features of people who are obese are being interpreted as related to infection.
Right.
But I'm guessing that most of it is the social value hypothesis, that obesity is associated with low social value for a number of reasons. A lot of these
Yeah.
for individuals are probably perceptions that other people find obese people to be less valuable.
Yeah.
And therefore, you're just not willing to invest in that pathogen
Hmm.
risk that's
Yeah.
present for any interaction partner.
Right. And what's great about that is that it's eminently testable, this idea. You could look at disgust toward people with physical abnormalities or obese people or whatever, and see if the relationship between the physical abnormality and the disgust is mediated by, say, a welfare trade-off ratio. And if that accounts for the relationship, then that would confirm the hypothesis that this is driven by social valuation rather than a pathogen cue per se. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Another interesting thing is that out of being very overweight versus being very underweight, I would suspect that underweight individuals are probably that would be more similar to the appearance of someone who is struggling to handle an infection than someone who's very overweight. That hasn't really been, I can't say that it hasn't been proposed, but I'm not familiar with the test of that hypothesis in the literature.
Mm. On that note of somebody struggling to deal with infection, one of the standing most important questions for all evolutionary psychologists to answer is what's up with zombies? Have you thought about that? Do you have a pet theory of zombies?
I've never thought of zombies, I'm
Okay,
afraid. And
yeah.
I
Because
know
we
that you
talked
just
about this
had, yeah.
Colton in his, I think we talked about Colton Scrivener in the morbidly curious stuff in just the genre of horror. And right, there's like a lot of cues of, this is a incapacitated, conspecific, with sort of a lot of cues of, I don't know, I channel Ed Hagen like zoonotic infection too, right? Like that's
Yeah.
another,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, it seems like a supernormal stimulus of
yeah,
pathogen risk. I mean, like their flesh is literally falling off their body,
yeah,
and
exactly.
their zombiehood is literally contagious.
Yeah,
You
they're
know, it's
eating
like the
brains. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Like it
It's
feels
like
like a
the
very
worst
deep trope.
possible.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
exactly of like a
yeah,
zoonotically infected conspecific who's coming for you, who's like got rabies or something. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting because people who have severe infections, they don't move around much.
Mm,
And I,
Mm.
I was I was an anthropology minor at ASU where I did my bachelor's degree, and I took multiple classes in the evolution of infectious disease. And my professor was fond of talking about how people pictured Ebola as zombies running after you,
yeah,
because Ebola, it's a hemorrhagic.
yeah,
I think I'm mispronouncing that. Anyway, it causes bleeding, but people are just listless. They're laying down. It's not like they're vomiting blood. Well, it's not like there's blood pouring from their
yeah,
pores all the time.
Yeah.
And this is going to be the case with most infections. And so when you think about zombies, whether they're sprinting, like in the 28 Days Later franchise, or kind of shuffling along like Dawn of the Dead, these are pathogen risks that you're almost never going to encounter. When I talk about emotional reactions to pathogen threats, emotion researchers might think about emotions varying along the lines of along an approach or avoidance continuum. Disgust and fear are both avoidance emotions. But the thing with disgust is that pathogens are not chasing you. Viruses and bacteria, they don't have legs, they can't travel long distances. They get in you by you touching something that has them on them. Lions and tigers and bears, these are the things that have their own legs and their own motivations to get to you.
mm,
And that's where you need different kinds of coordinating affective responses that motivate a different types of avoidance reaction. And so, looping back to zombies a little bit, it is interesting that kind of this archetype is combining the
yeah,
pathogen threat with the locomotion.
yeah,
Other than saying that's interesting, I
yeah,
haven't
yeah,
thought about
yeah,
zombies beyond
yeah.
this.
Yeah, I think it may be worth just saying like too, like this is also like the natural selection of like vectors, right? So disease vectors. So like from a pathogen's perspective, you can't you have to maintain your spreadability, right? So this is why diseases that involve like mosquitoes can really incapacitate the victim or the host, but other diseases that require, interaction, like if you really incapacitate a host right away, that might curtail your ability to spread, right? So like a cold, the person can still get up, walk around, and like spread it. But if you immediately incapacitate the person, then you're not going to spread. And so that's why, for example, like, diseases that are spread by mosquitoes or other like vectors that are not the primary host can be more virulent. So it's this virulence spreadability trade-off. And that's also something you kind of get from an evolutionary approach that you might not think of otherwise.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Paul Ewald wrote a book that also inspired me when I was an undergraduate at the Evolution of Infectious Disease, largely making this broad argument. And arboviruses, these are things spread by vectors or insect vectors. If falciparum malaria causes someone to just be bedbound for a week, well, the mosquito can just go to him and bring the parasite to someone else. And of course, that's not in the mosquito's interest either. The parasite is also manipulating the mosquito. Bubonic plague is similar. So the rats are running around with the fleas. It does get a little bit complex with these trade-offs, and there's asymptomatic periods also influence this. How naive the population is. I'm not really deep in the literature, but I've been told that it's not quite as straightforward as we might think in terms of just selection to low virulence versus spreadability. But yes, ultimately, it is another thing that only an evolutionary perspective gets you.
Yeah, cool. Speaking of an evolutionary approach, and we can transition to other stuff. I saw you at the most recent HBES, and you had a diatribe against evolutionary mismatch. And I at the time I didn't even have anything about evolutionary mismatch in any of my work, but like since I've thought about free will, I'm arguing that mismatch is important about free will. But I still think mismatch is over extended. But I don't know. Do you still have do you want to give us your take on evolutionary mismatch being, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think I gave you that. I would call it a monologue after a few beers. So maybe it did turn into a diatribe. Maybe the bar was just loud, so
No,
it
it
came out
was
that way.
all the above. It was yeah, exactly.
Yeah, sure. There's been something about the concept of mismatch that has struck me as not quite right for several years. And just slowly, I've kind of been able to articulate a few of those reasons. Although I haven't really talked with people about them other than a few side conversations. So maybe this can be a nice exercise that the audience can also listen around with. So the idea of evolutionary mismatch, as it's articulated in the evolutionary psychology literature, is that we have adaptations, but that are specialized for ancestral environments and are good for our fitness. But the environment has changed in some way, and it's often authors often say that the environment has changed more rapidly than we've had time to evolve psychological adaptations or non-psychological other types of adaptations to catch up, to then behave adaptively in this new environment. And so these mechanisms are no longer adaptive. They no longer have the same fitness associations. And authors often say that this has consequences for our well-being and our values and this type of stuff. And so is there anything that you guys have to add to that in kind of the boilerplate definition of a mismatch that I've missed?
The example that people love to throw out is junk food, that we gorge ourselves on junk food because it was scarce in ancestral environments, and that causes all sorts of health problems. People sometimes talk about pornography as a mismatch. Trying to think of other examples.
Social group size. So like, we evolved in a small scale social world, not to deal with large scale social dynamics, whether that involves like meeting strangers or understanding complicated social dynamics. Like the argument is social reactions and understandings are plainly for a smaller scale interpersonal world, not a large scale international world, for example. It would be another example, yeah.
So these are good examples. And I did listen to your guys' interview with Daniel Nettle, which I enjoyed quite a bit. And Daniel has written about and argued nicely on your podcast that this junk food idea doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. And that in ancestral environments, we should have, not rarely encountered situations where we could gorge ourselves on honey, for example, and that lots of other animals, non-human animals, have kind of stop mechanisms to keep themselves from over-consuming calories, and that obesity is not just eating too much sugar. There's a bunch of other factors during development that seem to lead people to vary in their BMI and their obesity and how they store body fat, et cetera. So I think that is a nice pushback to how some people have thought about junk food and just our modern food ecology mismatching with our evolved psychology. But I further question if the basic concept of mismatch is useful to evolutionary psychologists. I question the coherence of the idea. And I'll give you a few reasons why. One of them is that, if you take the Santa Barbara style evolutionary perspective, which both of you guys do, and is kind of the mainstream capital E, capital P evolutionary psychology, its orientation is to generate and test hypotheses about design features, not to look at the fitness consequences of those design features in any specific ecology, especially a specific ecology at a specific time. And so just even saying that this is mismatch because it has a different effect on fitness seems to be conflating, some kind of behavioral ecology perspective with an evolutionary psychology perspective in a way that's not really furthering knowledge in either area. But further, when we make these claims about a mismatch, no one is actually measuring fitness. So it's not that it's unfalsifiable, it's just never actually tested if it's a mismatch. Further, there's no consideration typically in what kind of phenotype would actually be matched, so to speak. So let's for a second go back to the junk food example. We say that our preferences for sugar are mismatched in the modern environment because ancestrally sugar, glucose or fructose, or I'm afraid that I might not be getting the terms exactly correct, but they're in fruits that have a lot of vitamins and nutrients that are really fitness good for us. Now they're in these low nutrient foods that are fitness neutral or fitness negative. Well, is the proposal then that our taste perception should find sugar disgusting right now? If we just could not tolerate the taste of sugar, is that a better phenotype than the current phenotype that we have? And are we then expecting, I would guess no, that people who find any flavors of sugar to be disgusting, that outcome would be worse than our current phenotypes that have their current sugar preferences. So are we saying that between these two kinds of theoretical endpoints that we could have, that anything is going to be a mismatch if it's not perfectly calibrated to the best fitness consequences of sugar preferences in this specific environment? If that's the case, are our adaptations mismatched in every single ecology we could be in? Because humans live in a ton of different ecologies. And in fact, I mean, that's the case now. But if we think about how the EEA, the Environment of Evolutionary Adaptiveness, is conceptualized, and just borrowing from how Tooby and Cosmes have discussed this, it's a statistical composite of the invariances across ecologies. But this is going to be a ton of different ecologies with a ton of different food sources, a ton of different social structures, et cetera. And so we should be kind of, aiming for some composite or average of all of these, not saying that, okay, this is how the condition was in the ancestral past, and our current environment is different than this one thing. The reality is every ecology is going to be different in some way from the statistical composite. And so both everything is a mismatch and nothing is a mismatch. And the final kind of point that I think I'll make is that identifying things as having bad fitness consequences or matching poorly is not at all straightforward. So if we think about snake detection, for example, so this is the classic kind of signal detection or error management theory outcome. There are asymmetric costs to false alarms versus misses in detecting snakes. And so the idea is that if you give people some ambiguous stimulus, like a little piece of wood that's shaped kind of like a snake, people's intuitive immediate response might be to categorize that as a snake until they get more information. And you could look at that and say, well, our minds are mismatched to that because we've acted like it's a snake, even though it's not a snake. And we've paid some metabolic cost and attentional cost to doing that. And a perfectly matched psychology wouldn't make that type of mistake. But the design feature is to make that kind of mistake because ancestrally there are asymmetric costs to having the mental mechanism be biased in one way versus the other. So simply the idea that we can observe something that doesn't appear to be optimized for the modern environment or for any kind of ecology it's not at all clear to me that that's evidence of the ecology being different or there being a misfiring in terms of the mental mechanism. It might have error by design for the benefits of having a certain number of errors over a certain amount of time. I might have one or two others, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah. I want to your physical neighbor Mark von Vogt has made a lot of mismatch. Have you had discussions with him about this?
I chatted with Mark a little bit about this a while ago, but haven't chatted about it since then. I would be
Yeah.
curious to do so. I don't know if he listens to the podcast.
Yeah, I don't
We could
either.
have
I mean, I
an
think
indirect
one like
conversation.
to characterize my understanding of how he uses it, like my read of his work is often he's talking to like organizational psychologists and sort of saying like, look, I'm studying leadership and things that you might not think would factor into people's leadership decision making are leaking in because they were evolutionarily relevant. Like, and I think like his argument is the reason to use mismatch. And I don't know what I think of this, but I'm curious what you think about this. Like his argument, I think would be like, it's code for sort of like you would think this would be irrelevant, but it turns out it is relevant. Like kind of like the pathogen thing, right? Like if you're coming from a business perspective, if you don't take an evolutionary approach, then you might think this would be irrelevant, but it turns out our evolved psychology is like for a world where other considerations other than like profitability is relevant and there's leakage of these other things that are in fact hurting profitability, for example, maybe, I don't know. But it's because our are evolved for evolution and offspring and in a natural ecology, not maximizing the bottom line. I don't know, I mean, does that what would that would be my argument, that like that would be Mark's argument. I don't know, what do you think about that?
Well, I'm quite sympathetic to this idea that if you're talking to lay people and they have some impression that if there's any evolutionary function of the mind, it's to figure things out and maximize utility or make us feel good or something like that, that it can be rhetorically useful to say that, look, our minds evolved for one thing, and that's not perfectly matched with what we consciously might be trying to do in a business environment.
Right.
My comments earlier are more how useful this concept is to us as evolutionary psychologists. And the term pops up in a lot of scientific papers of academics talking to each other, and in fact, evolutionary psychologists talking to each other. And I wonder, I mean, I don't know if if I'm right here, if these thoughts are sensible. I don't know if it's been a huge handicap to our field, if we've lost out on something by allocating time or energy to this idea, or if it's just something that people feel obligated to write in a paragraph without thinking about it too deeply and then moving on and doing the same stuff they would otherwise.
Right, like it's boilerplate. I mean, to straw man your argument, and I'll make this even stronger than what you're saying. I'm not saying you're saying this, would be it's sort of reflecting a laziness about not being adequately design minded, and that if you take input output process seriously, then it doesn't buy you anything. And if you just translate everything into like, here's one account, it says this is the design features. Here's another account, these are the design features. You know, it's not really buying you anything. I don't know. Is that fair? Or, I'm not saying you're saying that, but is that?
I think it is fair. And I mean, you guys have discussed multiple times how hard evolutionary psychology can be, since we have our own evolved psychologies to be perceiving ideas and individuals and our lived realities in different ways that aren't necessarily reflecting the design features of the mind. And I do think that it can be easy for evolutionary psychologists to think in these terms of mismatch because it's a very lay intuitive way to think about evolution. And so even if you're being extremely rigorous in one area and you're very focused on something, that it can be easy to slip into that kind of layperson type of thinking in other areas or at other times.
Yeah. It's easy to do website because it's just those stories. So.
Yeah. No, interestingly, I feel like, the Just So story might be valid when it comes to like lazy mismatch stories. Like it's easy to tell a lazy mismatch story to explain pretty much anything. And I think that speaks to the problem
Mm,
you're raising, Josh, is that this is not a useful tool and it can be very easily abused to explain anything you want to explain. It's the opposite of the kind of adaptationism and design mindedness that we want to be taking. And I think probably part of the motivation is that it gives us a kind of power to say you're wrong and bad, and here's how you can be right and smart. And I have the answers for how you can, live a better life. And, I've discovered the source of all of our problems. Give me status and attention for giving you the solutions. I think it's too easy to slip into that mindset of wanting to have the answers, of wanting to, give people solutions to all their problems, when really what we should be focused on is first understanding how the damn thing works. And then once we really have a good handle on how the mind works, then maybe we could start to get into tentative, proposals and solutions to people's problems and applications. But first, we just have to understand the thing. And I think we too often lose sight of that, and we skip ahead to the proposal part of it too quickly.
Yeah, I'll loop back into something else that your guest Daniel Nettle said a few episodes ago, which was kind of evolutionary psychology 1.0 or first generation evolutionary psychology was really popular because it was saying all these things that are obviously true that
mm,
other academics didn't want to
Yeah,
really talk about or
yeah.
dismiss away with
yeah,
language that's kind of non-intuitive.
yeah,
Evolutionary psychology 2.0 or more in-depth stuff is less penetrable and less intuitive. And I think there might be some overlap with mismatch in that it's really kind of the evolutionary psychology 1.0. But
Yeah.
then if that terminology makes any sense, but when you drill down to the meta theory and thinking about trying to identify and understand design features, the concept loses some of its appeal, some of its benefits and coherence.
Yeah. Do you think I mean, to bring it back to pathogen and discuss, do you think some of that early pathogen and discuss work was a little bit by like mismatchy?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it might be drawing a little bit on kind of lay intuitions about how these systems might work. Although I'll also say that I think that it's perfectly scientifically defensible to think about the system being very general. And that
yeah,
I don't think that the people working early in this area were doing anything intellectually wrong or
Yeah.
lazy.
Mm.
I think that it was an open question, and my read of the data is that there's greater specificity than first assumed, but I wouldn't attribute that outcome to laziness or anything by those researchers.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think to just say the loud part out loud is my read of that work was people wanted genuinely to provide a biologically plausible account of a phenomenon. And you're allowed to say, be speculative and say, here's this other biologically plausible thing. Maybe it accounts for this thing that doesn't yet have an adequate biological grounding,
Yeah, yeah.
but it might be wrong. And that's great. Then we'll know something. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, part of why I love your work, Josh, is that you've led the charge in sort of clearing away some of these first pass ideas that were wrong turns or misleading in various ways. And this isn't to disparage the people who came up with them, but this is part of how science works: is we come up with ideas and we dismiss the ones that aren't working or that are colliding with reality. And I like that you have shaped my thinking both on outgroups, also on this idea that discuss sensitivity should lead you to prefer facial symmetry and sexual dimorphism more. I was reading one of your papers on that turns out that hasn't really panned out. I'm curious, what do you think about this idea that pathogen sensitivity should relate to conformity? I know this is another one that was popular in the field. I'm curious, has that stood the test of time, or has that been shaky as well?
I can't comment on it too much. My collaborator Florian van Leeuwen, who also
Mm,
works in the Netherlands, has published an 8 study paper evaluating that idea.
Mhm.
And my read of it is that this is not a robust phenomenon,
Okay.
but I'm afraid that I don't recall enough of the nuances to comment on it deeply. I can recommend a pivot. We'll see how deeply we can get into it in the interest of time. And that is a different aspect of disgust, and that is how it relates to moral judgment, moral
Yeah.
condemnation.
What is
Yes.
morality and
So
disgust? Yeah. What is
this could be like
disgusting?
another 2 hour
I
podcast.
know.
So we'll see if we want to do a 15-minute now or just go for another 2 hours. But so yes, and this is a strong pivot,
Oh, I'm
although
glad you
not
did. I would have done it myself. I was
Yeah.
aching
Yeah.
to get to this topic
Yeah.
myself. So,
Exactly.
maybe not quite as much of a high level overview as I did with pathogen avoidance, but there's a classic paper in social psychology by John Haidt, who researchers might be more familiar with for moral foundations theory or for his more recent work on advocating against social media for teenage girls. But his highest impact paper, and I'm not sure if this has the same impact as the Henrik et al. Weird paper, it's like that kind of level of citations. But it was effectively arguing that a lot of our moral judgments are not stemming from moral reasoning and considerations of who's been harmed or victimized by certain interactions, but rather by social or emotional intuitions, and then our argumentation afterward, or our justifications and our reasoning is actually argumentation for why we're having these judgments. And one of Haidt's examples really focused on, or some of Haidt's examples really focused on disgust related things because they seem to be victimless crimes. And he pointed out what, it's kind of a thought experiment. It was described as a study, although it was never really published. This famous in the moral psychology literature story about Mark and Julie. Mark and Julie are brother and sister. They love each other deeply. They go on vacation. They care about each other, and so they decide to have sex. And then in the story, all of the kind of plausible harms that could result from this are neutralized in the vignette. They take, she's on hormonal contraception, they use a condom, they're not emotionally damaged by it, they never do it again, no one ever finds out about it. And according to this idea, participants are morally dumbfounded. They still find that it's wrong, even though they can't justify it at that point. So this led to an idea that people's intuitions about disgust are feeding into and producing a lot of their moral judgments. And this led to a small explosion of research in social psychology in the mid to late aughts, testing whether if you make people disgusted, that increases the degree to which they will morally condemn actions. And so there were a lot of, you could call them disgust primes, people smelling bad odors or looking at gross pictures or being hypnotized. And finding after finding after finding showed that when you make people disgusted, they think that stealing is more wrong. All these individual items that describe something that could be morally condemned, people condemn them more on a Likert scale. Well, in 2015 or so, there was a meta-analysis of this literature, and the outcome was that there's nothing there, that the meta-analyzed effect size is very, very small, and if you take into account publication bias, it's effectively zero. And so this idea, combined with another line of research on not priming, but reports of disgust toward immoral behaviors. So not feeling disgusted and then condemning something, but seeing something that's condemnable and saying you're disgusted by it, has led to kind of a backlash against the idea that disgust is at all relevant to moral psychology. And some social psychologists have made strong arguments, or at least strong statements along these lines, that there's nothing important about disgust in terms of moral cognition. And others, you had Leo Fatucci on a while ago, and he has also argued that purity can be just boiled down to perceptions of self-control and other kinds of more general dimensions of reciprocity and interdependence, et cetera. And in some of those arguments, there's been some connection back to this discussed literature, although it's not a complete critique. I think that the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater a little bit too early here. And so a lot of the research that I'm currently doing alongside the pathogen research is trying to better untangle this potential relation between disgust and morality, which might be several different types of relationships, and try to understand why that relationship might exist.
Have you discovered anything so far? Do you have any guesses as to what you'll find?
So we do have some findings that I'm kind of excited about, but maybe just think higher level what the phenomenon are that we're talking about. So for one thing, we talk about disgust as one thing. It's kind of a folk emotion. And there's been a lot of resistance to talking about moral disgust because when people say disgust, they're thinking specifically about pathogen disgust. And they're saying that if something doesn't have, from an emotions perspective, appraisals and action tendencies, et cetera, that correspond with pathogen disgust, then it's not really disgust. And so if we're talking about any relation between disgust and morality, that's not really disgust. That's just some kind of metaphor. That's really anger, or that's people being confused, or something like that. So I think that that's really limited our scientific understanding about this relationship, in which people are really saying pathogen disgust is the only thing important in terms of all these things that we could call disgust. And so if there's disgust in the moral domain, that's kind of a category error. And we shouldn't really be even thinking about that as something distinct from anger. My lab does have a lot of findings showing that you can get distinct reports of disgust versus anger to moral violations, dependent on whether the moral violation imposed costs on you versus someone else. So if you take the exact same action and you describe it as happening to you, the participant, versus someone else, you get different effects on disgust versus anger. If it happened to someone else, disgust is higher than if it happened to you. And if it happened to you, anger is higher than it happened to someone else. And we further asked participants, what kind of motivations do you have in response to this moral violation? And we divide them into direct aggression versus indirect aggression. And we see that reports of anger relate to desires to directly aggress against someone, whereas reports of disgust relate to desires to indirectly aggress towards someone. We have several studies replicating this finding, also showing that the identity of the victim in terms of their interpersonal value relates differently to disgust and anger. So the more valuable the victim is, the more angry you are, but not necessarily the more disgusted. And when we show participants photos of people making disgust versus anger expressions and disgust versus anger vocalizations, they make inferences about direct aggression and indirect aggression differently across those. So again,
question.
Yeah.
If I interrupt real quickly, have you also looked at the social value of the perpetrator in addition to the social value of the victim? Because you might expect that if we view the perpetrator as having lower social value, that might predict greater disgust relative to anger.
That's a major part of what we're looking into right now. So when I tell people about this research program, I tell them that in the moral foundations theory literature, a lot of the disgust and morality literature, the ideas are really tied to the content of the action itself, rather than who is involved in the action. But if you think about, and sorry to get political here, guys, but this was topical at the time when I was giving these talks a lot. Donald Trump had recently gone to Arlington National Cemetery and had this photo op where he had thumbs up and a big grin over a guy's grave. And you had very different responses depending on who you were and what your value of Trump was, your coalitional value, and him as a leader in your coalition. And people who were not in the MAGA coalition often expressed disgust toward this. And people who are not in the MAGA coalition were not bothered by it at all.
Or who were who were in the MAGA coalition,
Yes, sorry, people who were in the MAGA coalition were not bothered at all. And so that has something very specific to do with the identity of that person and what their interpersonal or coalitional value is to you. And you could also think about anger having a different relation with valuation, in that for people who are higher value to you, or people who you're going to have a long-term relationship with, directly intervening and broadcasting how you view your valuation, how you perceive how you're valued by them, and
Yeah.
changing that and letting that be known can be beneficial to you, versus being disgusted by them and maybe not directly intervening, but spreading reputationally damaging information about that person. That's not beneficial to you if that person is a valuable interaction partner to you.
Mm.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is one phenomenon of the relation between disgust and morality, in that we observe people engaging in behaviors, and we often have these morally condemning responses, but the affective tinges of those responses differ depending on who is affected by the action and who is engaging in the action. And I think that just saying that disgust is irrelevant to this and we should just be thinking about general outrage or this just being anger loses out on understanding a lot of important things. The other body of findings is that when people engage in behaviors that you yourself would be disgusted to engage in, we sometimes condemn those individuals. Again, that's a very different phenomenon, potentially with a different explanation that needs to be demanded. But I think that is a phenomenon, and it's not just representative of assessing people on self-control or assessing the degree to which their behaviors harm other individuals, which are kind of the alternatives that have claimed that there's nothing unique or important about the relation between disgust and morality. So I can just share with you guys a couple of findings that we have that I find are interesting and supportive of this idea. One is that we've sampled vegetarians who are a really nice population for testing this idea, because they vary on the degree to which, they vary on their feelings toward meat eaters. They also vary on how much disgust they would experience by consuming meat. So we asked them specifically a bunch of questions with, imagine that you ate a veggie burger that had been cooked in the same pan as a beef burger. Imagine you ate a pasta sauce and you later found out that it actually had some ground beef in it, et cetera. And then we asked them how negatively they feel about individuals who engage in a variety of what you could call norm violations. Some of these are cooperative violations. Some of these are hygiene violations. Some of these are unusually large amounts of eating meat. And what we find is that vegetarians' self-disgust, how disgusted they would be by eating meat, uniquely and most strongly predicts their negative evaluations of these meat-eating actions, not the hygiene actions or the cooperative norm interactions. And further, it predicts that independent of their moral motivations for being a vegetarian. So we also ask them, are you a moral vegetarian or a health vegetarian? We have them complete individual differences measures that assess how strongly their vegetarianism is motivated by these moral motivations. There's really this strong residual and strongest effect of their own disgust toward the behavior in terms of condemning other individuals for engaging the behavior. We have further research that's extended this, where we use multi-level modeling approaches, where we both look at within participant the degree to which they're disgusted by a bunch of things that could evoke disgust, and then their condemnation of other individuals who engage in these behaviors. And the relation within participant between their own disgust toward engaging in behaviors and how strongly they condemn people is there. And that's stronger than if you do the same thing with other emotions like fear. So you see how scared they would be of doing different things. And then you ask them how much they condemn people who engage in these behaviors that could be scary. And so we think that there is something here. It is important. And it hasn't been adequately tested by just using priming studies or having disgust sensitivity instruments. And we have some other ideas as to why this might be the case, but we haven't really tested those, but we could talk about some of those ideas.
I would love to. I mean, that's actually absolutely fascinating. I'm really excited to, read the stuff when it comes out, and those are really cool results. I'd love to hear, what your thinking is on the why question.
So it's really strongly influenced by ideas that were originally developed by Peter DeScioli and Rob Kurzban, and those were, of course, probably influenced by John Tooby and Lita Cosmes as well. So Peter and Rob, in one of their great papers on the mysteries of morality, proposed that you might see disgust being moralized sometimes because it could be acting as a cue to whether you have any advantage in engaging in behavior in the future. And their general idea is that people should be having moral sentiments that contribute to shaping or resisting rules that are either shaping rules that are beneficial to you or resisting rules that are costly to you. The idea that you feel disgust toward doing something is a good indication that you would never do it yourself. And so there's very little cost toward endorsing rules against that. Now, going back to Deb Lieberman's conversation with you guys on this topic, Deb has a slightly different view on this, I think, although our views are quite complementary. Deb really emphasizes the idea that people who engage in behaviors that others find disgusting are good candidates for exploitation, in that they're just generally going to be low value. So this could be a good kind of coordination mechanism for people to all gang up on the same individual. Right. I think that probably happens, although I think that there are probably other types of processes in which people just don't resist rules that don't actually impose costs on them. And so through processes of cultural evolution, you can kind of get these as gravity points where if rules are constantly or repeatedly being proposed and cycling through, and some of them are transmitted and maintained in populations. And part of what influences whether they're maintained and transmitted is people objecting to them or making arguments against them. Well, if people only pay costs in terms of arguing against certain rules, and they don't get any benefits from arguing against them, you could get these disgust-oriented ones popping up quite a bit and being a little bit sticky and a little bit cross-culturally prevalent. So I think that this line of thinking has something to say about the prevalence of incest taboos, which is kind of a puzzle because almost no one wants to sleep with their siblings or their parents. It can happen occasionally, but it's very, very rare. And the actual consequences of it for most people are almost zero. So it's not good for your kin. Like if your sibling sleeps with your parent, that has some inclusive fitness costs to you. But for other people, it's not really all that relevant. What we should expect is that people really don't want to do it themselves, but to actually condemn other people, and for this again to be so cross-culturally prevalent, is kind of strange. Now, if you do think about the idea that if different rules are proposed all the time and certain ones are sticky and people just don't disagree with them, well, if incest is one of the most disgusting things that people could kind of imagine engaging in, you're going to have very little pushback, and then people can maybe coordinate around this specific rule. And so this might partially explain why you get so many rules around kind of minority sexual behaviors that most people would be disgusted to engage in. I think that this has something to say with the cross-cultural condemnation of homosexuality. So this is kind of difficult for us weird researchers to completely understand, although us older millennials may be a little bit better than my Gen Z students. But Western Europeans, and to an extent Americans, are living in really extraordinary times in terms of acceptance of homosexuality. And when I show Pew Research data on the proportion of individuals in different countries who think that homosexuality is unacceptable, it's really shocking. And you get this across countries with very different economic systems and very different religions and very different cultural histories. And so for some reason, this has just been popping up in different areas. And of course, it's been transmitted into some areas. But again, you get, China, South Korea, the Middle East, sub-Saharan Africa being very large, with very different kind of colonial histories and cultural transmission histories. And so you get this being fairly sticky, but you also have this fascinating phenomenon where it's quickly extinguished. So it seems like it'll never change until it does, and then it changes very quickly. And I think that this is also somewhat compatible with thinking about disgust shaping rules, in that if we take the perspective of an average person in a society, and the rule is proposed that homosexuality is wrong, and they implicitly think, okay, I engage in homosexuality, I'm disgusted by that thought. And that's not to say there's anything disgusting about homosexual individuals, but most people are disgusted by the thought of engaging sex with most other individuals. But if you're not homosexual, that thought might have a tinge of disgust. And that might be a cue to, well, I'm never going to benefit from that behavior in the first place because I experience disgust toward it. So I'm not going to resist rules that homosexuality is wrong. Well, if enough people start resisting that rule, then you also don't have much of a benefit in saying, no, I really, really want homosexuality to be wrong. Of course, some people do, depending on how many people in their coalition are saying that. But for a lot of people, this house could crumble pretty quickly if they're not in those coalitions where that rule is kind of a sacred value that's non-negotiable. And so you can have potentially this phenomenon where it lasts at a very stable level for a long time, but then can crumble quickly. And I looked at general social survey data a while ago, and you saw very high, very consistent ratings of homosexuality being extremely wrong or always wrong or something from when the survey started in the early 70s until the mid to late 90s. And then it just assessment after assessment, it's almost going down in a linear fashion. And that's not the case with other types of sexual rules. So another question on the survey was, is adultery wrong? And there you started out at almost the exact same level as homosexuality. It's kept at almost the exact same level. And that's a rule where pretty much everyone can be disadvantaged by having their spouse commit infidelity. So you should see people being much less flexible in dumping that once there's momentum from other people in doing so. And in fact, we do see, and I'm sometimes approached with surprise from people in the polyamory community or the ethical non-monogamy community that, oh, this is getting really big. And no, it's not. It's getting big within very, very small circles, but it's really not penetrating the broader population because people do perceive these costs in terms of their monogamous relationships. So just to put a bow on that, I think that there is this relation between self-experienced disgust and your degree, the way that you view other individuals who engage in these behaviors. And I think that part of the reason why these disgust-based rules seem to pop up a lot and be a little bit sticky is because of the information that one's own experiences of disgust gives about the consequences of these behaviors or rules in the ecology.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Super important.
Yeah, really important. I do kind of lean toward Deb's take here, and that I think I totally buy the logic that it is less that endorsing a rule against something that I find disgusting doesn't cost me anything, right? But in order for my own disgust to affect my moral judgments, it also has to affect the benefit side of it as well. Like if it merely didn't impose a cost on me, then I would be neutral about it. But in order for me to actively morally campaign against something, there has to be something in it for me, some sort of benefit for my own disgust to translate into moral judgment. And I think something like the Deb reasoning, where it gives me an opportunity to exploit or exclude or dominate someone else, that benefit side of things might also be playing a role here as well. And you could make the further prediction that when there is, say, greater resource scarcity, greater zero-sumness, greater incentive to exclude and exploit people, that you might see an increase in these kinds of disgust-based moral rules, and that people are just looking for opportunities to exclude people or exploit people, and are actively searching the rule space for rules that they can use to marginalize people because it's in a very zero-sum context or a very resource-limited context, and you might see these disgust-based rules more likely to pop up in those kinds of environments. I'm curious what you think of that idea.
Yeah, that sounds totally plausible to me. And I should emphasize again that I think that these different perspectives are completely compatible.
Yeah.
There is a cost to not moralizing that is independent of benefits of exploitation, I think, in that if there's 10 people in a circle and 9 of them have said, I think that incest is wrong, and then you say, actually, I don't want to moralize that, or actually, I don't think it's that wrong,
Yeah.
You could then be a target of that coalition.
Correct.
And so you could certainly benefit from ganging up on the person who's accused of committing incest. And there's probably a lot of overlap between that, but simply not agreeing with the moral sentiment when other people are advertising it or asking your opinion about it is a cost in of itself.
That's true.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
but that presupposes that that you have the 9 people who are coming out against it or asking your opinion about it, and it seems like it's still kind of mysterious why people would have an opinion about it or ask your judgment about it in the first place. Like, why do people care at all? Unless they're actively looking for rules that they can enforce and use to exploit or marginalize people.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally true. I mean, another question is, should it be your own disgust toward engaging in the behavior versus your perception of how disgusted other people are toward engaging the behavior? So is your own disgust going to be diagnostic of the exploitation value of this individual, or is your perception of how disgusted other people?
Yeah, and
Hmm.
I think like a lot of people, their moral outrage is just sort of throwing things on the wall and seeing what sticks. Like I think a lot of people like rail against things, and everyone's like, why do you care about that? You know? I mean, I think some people are clever and really gauge the reaction of third parties. Like if it seems like to me there's design in all of us to just sort of be morally outraged and just generate like this bothering me, I'm going to say it out loud. But there's
Yeah.
another subset of people who are sort of like I'm going to look and see what gets reaction from people, like a politician, whether
Yeah.
explicitly a politician or not. And that seems like it's a strategy of people, and there's real sensitivity to like what I'm getting a response from and not. And those are the people who are sort of like internalize the ambient cultural reactions of people, but may not feel them themselves.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah. No, that's a good example of a case where someone would actively benefit from the rule, like a politician who might rise to power by demonizing, say, a group of people or a disgusting practice. It seems that you could test the Deb perspective by seeing if, say, dark triad traits interact with personal disgust to predict moral condemnation, such that I'm more likely to moralize behaviors I find disgusting if I'm a high dark triad person who's looking for opportunities to exploit people or to aggress against people. And it seems like that would be a prediction entailed by the dead perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thought. Going back to John Haidt's work in moral foundations theory, the idea there is that people vary in the degree to which they prioritize these different kinds of domains in terms of making their moral judgments. And some people prioritize purity more in deciding whether or not something is wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that you can, regardless of whether the categorization of moral domains or that idea is correct, it is recognizable that you could have 2 people who are equally disgusted by engaging in some kind of sexual practice, and one of them is going to strongly morally condemn someone, and another person is going to say, live and let live, or this is not my business. And
Yeah.
understanding what separates those people in terms of personality variation, which you've referred to,
Mhm.
Pinsoff,
Yeah.
or kind of broader strategic orientations based on exploitation versus cooperation.
There's
Mhm.
also a thing of it's not just exploitation of certain outgroups. It even happens within an individual. Like I'm thinking like religious beliefs where we are to sort of say, all of us are sinners. We all have bad parts of us. And I'm broadcasting an idea of we all have temptations to do the wrong thing. And I'm signaling we're all going to coordinate about the right thing to do. So the moralization is sort of like there's a counterfactual world where we all do the wrong thing, but I'm going to sort of broadcast we're going to curtail that in ourselves, but instead do this other thing. And I think that also could be a benefit, David, without exploiting anybody, where it's sort of the what we're moralizing is we might all do the wrong thing, but I am advertising this is a way to be better or get better stuff or do the right thing, which is something organisms should care about. But I get some benefits by being the leader of that. You might defer to me. I might have status. I might say, look, we've all had bad things happen to us. I'm going to show you the right way to do things. And so the
Mhm.
moralization of what's bad may not be individuals that we exclude. It might be the paths that we might all take. And I'm going to say we might fall into moral badness. We might get bad outcomes. Listen to me, and I will guide you to the morally superior outcome. I think that's also a trope, and that can involve even
Mhm.
not in excluding anybody per se, but just a paths of policy or paths individuals might take even within our own group.
I like that way of thinking. So, insofar as you care more about the right, non-disgusting thing to do, you might be more likely to moralize the disgusting, wrong thing to do. And that, say, if I care more about a certain type of sexual strategy, and I view that as the right path, and I really care about coordinating around that particular sexual strategy, I'm going to be more likely to moralize anything that is outside of that sexual strategy or deviant from it.
Or,
Whereas if
or
I don't, yeah,
yeah, or even the reverse. It's just like
yeah,
the question is like, what would the benefit be? How would I benefit from moralizing that doesn't involve excluding somebody? And it would
Mm.
just be that I just do the calculation of I want to have high status. I want to be listened to. I don't want to
mm,
exclude anybody. How can I square that circle? Well, I'm just going to say, look, everybody who I'm not excluding anybody, but I'm just sort of saying, look, you should listen to me because there's a class of outcomes that we might all engage in that are disgusting or morally bad, but I can give you a way to avoid that. So it's just an example of, so you might not even like care about the thing, but it's just you're like, okay, this is a way to get status without excluding anybody, but still using that cudgel of disgust and moralization as a way to get your own status achieved.
mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, oh, we've been going on for so long, but I want to get one last question because I've been thinking about alliances and the role they might play in disgust. And so I've been doing some math modeling work on the simple majority game, which is a three-player game where or three or more where a subset of players coordinate to receive a benefit while the outsider to that subset incurs a cost. And so it's basically a coordination game where you can coordinate to get a benefit, and whoever is outside of the subset incurs a cost. And there are a number of situations that might apply to. Say there's a communal resource, we could form an alliance and exclude one or more people from that resource to get a higher share of it for ourselves. If we all have our own private resources, two of us could gang up on someone and take their resource, assuming they submit to us. These are all kind of versions of the simple majority game, and I'm thinking of of a bunch of different examples of this, how this would play out. But one thing I've discovered is that there are a lot of ESSs or evolutionarily stable strategies in this game that relate to what I call transitivity. So the friend of my friend is my friend. The enemy of my friend is my enemy. The friend of my enemy is my enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So these are all ESSs in the simple majority game because facilitate coordination on an alliance. It's much easier for me to coordinate on an alliance with you if we share the same enemies and share the same friends, right? If we have different enemies and different friends, we're going to disagree about what alliance we prefer, about who we prefer to be an insider and who we prefer to be an outsider. Um, and so, because of these transitivity rules, that creates a kind of social contagion, such that if I do something that signals my enmity toward the group or disloyalty to the group, that not only means that you should oppose me, you should oppose anyone who supports me. And if we use cues of similarity as cues of allegiance, then you might also want to oppose anything that's similar to me, or that suggests that you're similar to me, or that suggests that you're maybe, even if you're a family member of me, my norm violation might contaminate to my family members because they're going to be viewed as my friends. And from the group's perspective, the friend of my enemy is my enemy, right? And so because of these alliance dynamics, when you do anything that signals disloyalty or enmity toward a group of people, it creates a kind of contagion where everyone is rushing to signal that they oppose that person and anyone or anything who is associated with that person, which is isomorphic to the logic of contagion, right? In the same way, if that person is contagious, you also want to avoid that person and avoid anyone who has made contact with them and avoid any objects that have been in contact with that person. And so, because the logic of contagion is similar with alliances, and with pathogens, it would have been a very ideal emotion to co-opt by natural selection to serve this new function of dealing with social contagion as opposed to pathogen contagion. I think this might explain some of the properties of moral disgust, and that it's geared toward the kind of contagion that can flow through a social network when a moral violation is committed or when a signal of disloyalty is sent. And so I'm curious what you think of that logic and whether that fits in with some of your research on moral disgust.
Yeah, what you say about the common properties with physical contamination and contagion makes a lot of sense to me. And
Yeah.
what I really like about that, David, is you've taken something that kind of, when you don't think too hard about it, makes sense, and you've kind of laid a foundation to understand it more systematically. Um, There are critical differences, of course, in that with pathogen disgust, it really is about physical contact
Yeah.
versus with moral disgust, not so much, but it is maybe about being seen associating with the individual, as you suggest. Now, if we think about the types of behavioral motivations that we've observed that are corresponding with reports of disgust versus reports of anger, um, these are related to indirect aggression, damaging the person's reputation, gossiping about them, letting people know what they've done. And we've mostly been thinking about those things in terms of imposing costs on the individual. But gossip could also be protecting you from inferences from others that you agree or that you're an ally of that target.
Mhm.
Um, and oftentimes when people think about moral disgust versus pathogen disgust, the reason why there's a common word is that there is some commonality in the phenomenology, and there's some overlap in the facial expressions.
Mhm.
And of course, this gets encoded in language, and it's not unique to English as well.
Mm.
And so a question is there something that's sufficiently overlapping in the phenomenology that's reflecting both of those functions, the contamination avoidance, the contagion avoidance in terms of physical properties versus the contamination avoidance in terms of alliance detection or cooperation?
Mhm.
Um, I'm not sure. I don't have an answer to that. What the function of the phenomenology, if there is one, in terms of disgust in the moral realm. In terms of facial expression or vocal expression, that could be co-opted pretty easily, I think, if there's a signal of contagion physically, that then people can make an inference of contagion perception more socially or symbolically. I could see that happening fairly easily. Well, I shouldn't say fairly easily. I could see that bridge happening. One thing that I've pondered about with this shared phenomenology, which people say that they're sick to their stomach, and I personally have experienced phenomenology that seems to overlap with smelling something bad toward social violations that others have engaged in. I think back to an analogy that Rob Kurzban made in terms of effort, in that you can have people talk about something being effortful in terms of mental effort related to, the old ego depletion studies are not eating chocolate chip cookies or eating radishes instead, or having to identify, circle, dot every I in a sentence or something like this. And that feels effortful, not in an identical way, but in a similar enough way that it feels effortful to run a marathon or something like that, or lift weights a lot. And that this similarity in phenomenology isn't reflecting underlying similarity in metabolic effort or something like that, which that assumption kind of led some research down the wrong path in trying to explain mental effort. But it's probably some kind of representation of opportunity costs. And you can pay high opportunity costs by proceeding with a mundane typing task when you're not getting any feedback of things that are beneficial for you. Or you can pay opportunity costs in terms of caloric or muscle or strength or whatever output in terms of a task where you're also not getting feedback of any kinds of benefits. And so their proposal was that sense of effort is actually a representation of opportunity costs, but opportunity costs can vary quite a bit across domains. Now, whether that commonality across moral disgust and pathogen disgust is a representation of contagion, but in pathogen contagion versus reputational or alliance or social contagion, which I have not thought about in those terms before, versus something else that I've thought about, which is some representation of valuation, which is you can have low valuation in terms of caloric or contact benefits relative to pathogen costs, or you could have low valuation in terms of association based on that person's behavior rather than how other people are going to treat you for being around that person, although those aren't mutually exclusive either. A person's valuation could partially be what your relationship with them would be reputationally in the eyes of others. So all of this is to say, I find the account promising and convincing, but whittling down on why there's that commonality in phenomenology and outputs, I'm not completely sure yet.
Yeah, cool.
Well, this was great. Josh, you're well into the evening hours here, and we might have just lost Josh. Can you hear us?
All right.
I'm back. I
You're
think
back.
I think my connection cut me off like mid-sentence after.
No, you are great though. I think we got
Yeah.
that all. That you were just saying how ego depletion is all right.
Thumbs up.
Yeah, that's no, yeah. I think you left off where, where you think it's interesting, but getting more specific about why the phenomenology overlaps in those two cases, it would be promising.
Yeah, the idea that there might be a common higher level commonality in terms of sort of what it affords to the organism is sort of this possible idea.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Very cool. Well, Josh, we've taken up a lot of your time. I know it's late there. I don't even think we have time for the what we should have asked you question, but I think you've already done that, unless there's another.
I think we've covered all the bases.
Yeah.